The pathetically little remnant of the once dominant Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, was known by the unremarkable moniker Special Sea Attack Force, SSAF. But in the Japanese military, the word special had a distinct and sinister connotation. When the surrender of Japan became clear in late 1944, the desperate Japanese started to promote kamikaze, or suicide aircraft, operations, and established special groups to carry them out. Special Sea Attack Force became the euphemistic moniker for a suicide sea attack force, and special became a non-threatening euphemism for suicidal. There were only 10 ships in the SSAF. The most important of these was the formidable battleship Yamato, the pride of the IJN and the largest dreadnought in the world. In a last-ditch effort to destroy the American fleet, the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, Asashimo, Fuyutsuki, Hamasaze, Hashimo, Isokaze, Kasumi, Suzutsuki, and Yukikyuze, were to accompany her to her heroic demise. Why only 2 of the super-battleship Yamato-class were constructed? Although the Japanese Naval General Staff was already preparing for the impending confrontation with the United States, the design and construction of these battleships started in October 1934, long before Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor. As a result, they directed their Navy Technical Department, Kampon, to provide a report on the viability of developing a new class of battleships that were better than anything that the United States had produced to that point. The Americans could build far more battleships than Japan could ever make, but the Japanese designers were confident they could create more potent battleships than the Americans. The Japanese understood they could not match the Americans in quantity. On December 29, 1934, the Japanese government gave the required 2 years' notice that, after December 31, 1936, Japan would no longer be a party to either the 1922 Washington or the 1930 London naval treaties, indicating that it had little doubt that these super battleships could be designed and constructed. Japan now completely rejects the limitations on Japanese naval weapons that were included in both accords. Japan unilaterally announced on January 1, 1937, that it would no longer be subject to these treaties or any limitations of any kind on its rapidly growing military. The 3 ships were immediately put into production under the Third Fleet Replenishment Program once the final construction designs were approved in March 1937. Each ship was named after an old Japanese prefecture in accordance with tradition. On July 7, 1937, Japan launched an invasion of China that went beyond simple saber rattling and muscle flexing. Only 3 Yamato-class battleships were constructed, but the Yamato was the first of 5 planned. The second Yamato-class ship, the Musashi, was put into service on August 5, 1942, while the Yamato was put into service on December 16, 1941. In order to compensate for the Japanese carrier losses during the Battle of Midway in early June 1942, the Shinano, a third Yamato-class battleship, was hastily converted into an aircraft carrier while still in the building stage. The American submarine Archer Fish, SS-311, attacked and sank the carrier Shinanowa's on the second day of her inaugural sail, 10 days after it was formally commissioned on November 19, 1944. According to their final production plan, the Yamato-class battleships had an overall length of 862.83 feet and a fully loaded displacement of 7,800 long tons, 73968 metric tons, 81536 short tons. Their maximum speed was 27 knots. In contrast, the new American Iowa-class battleships had a maximum speed of 33 knots and were 887 feet long, but they only displaced 45,000 tons. Officer Naoyoshi Ishida, who served on the Yamato, recalls his first impression of her. How enormous it is. There are arrows indicating which direction is the front and which is the back as soon as you enter. Otherwise, it is impossible to know. I didn't even know how to return to my own lodgings for a few days. That was the case with everyone. I was aware that it was a pretty strong battleship. They were huge firearms. I had a strong desire to fight alongside an American battleship in the Pacific at the time. The Japanese had a strong belief that the battleships Yamato and Musashi were unbeatable and unsinkable since they were both heavily armed and armored. Both battleships were equipped with 9 18.1-inch 460mm cannons, which were unmatched by the 9 16-inch 406mm guns found aboard America's best warships, the Iowa-class battleships. At 40-second intervals, the Yamato's armor-piercing 18.1-inch rounds, which weighed 3,200 pounds each, could be launched over 25 kilometers. This was the best Western warship ever built. A reluctance to utilize Musashi and Yamato. However, once the Yamato and Musashi soon were finished, the Japanese faced challenges. Due of their weight, the two battleships used a lot of fuel oil, which was not readily available in Japan. The fact that the battleships were not only potent weapons, but also potent symbols of national pride was another factor to take into account. Their loss would have a devastating effect on both Navy and national morale. As a result, the battleships were to be utilized sparingly and only in the latter stages of the war, when the Japanese Naval General Staff began to see the looming threat of loss. There were several excuses offered for not employing the Yamato, but the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, the IJN's primary ocean-going unit, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, showed he was reluctant to commit his flagship, the Yamato, to combat, even after Yamamoto lost his life when the United States shot down his plane. His successors didn't use either Yamato or Musashi in any major battle until the last few months of the war, when they sent Army Air Force P-38 Lightning fighters on April 18, 1943. The Japanese crews of cruisers and destroyers in the Pacific Ocean dubbed the battleship Yamato Hotel Yamato. Between her arrival on August 29, 1942, and her departure on May 8, 1943, the battleship was only away from its Japanese naval station at Truk Island in the Caroline Islands for one day. She also did not participate in the pivotal Solomon Islands campaign, which lasted from August 7, 1942 to February 1943. The IJN admirals were terrified and did not want to lose the Yamato after she was damaged by a torpedo fired from the USS Kate, SS-305, while on patrol in December 1943. Later in the war, she finally saw combat, taking part in operations in the Philippine Sea and subsequently destroying a small American fleet off Samar while serving as Admiral Takeo Kurida's command ship. The war's most tragic and heroic act. The Americans were getting ready to invade the Philippine Islands after island-hopping their way across the Pacific by early October 1944. The goal of the Japanese naval defensive strategy, codenamed Shoei Go, Victory, was straightforward: destroy the American invasion fleet, keep the Philippines under Japanese rule, and so save Japan from invasion. In a desperate attempt to eliminate the American invasion force, the Japanese committed almost every remaining member of the IJN to achieve this goal, but they were committing what was left of a fleet without air support. Importantly, at what became known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, both Yamato and Musashi pledged to stop America. The Musashi was sunk on October 24, 1944, by 17 bombings and 19 torpedoes. 1023 of the 2399 person crew died, and the Americans lost 18 aircraft. During the engagement, the Yamato took comparatively little serious damage and escaped. On April 1, 1945, the Americans invaded Okinawa as part of Operation Iceberg, pushing them closer to the central Japanese home islands while defeating the Japanese at Leyte Gulf. Okinawa was part of the Ryukyu Islands, which had joined the Japanese Empire in 1879 in defiance of Chinese protests. The Japanese viewed Okinawa as a part of their nation as a result of this annexation, and they would stop at nothing to protect it. As the American invasion of Okinawa began, the Japanese were increasingly frantic. The Japanese had to fully employ their formidable last-ditch countermeasure, the Special Forces, the suicidal kamikaze, as a result of the American victory, and for the first time, this included the Navy. On April 3, 1945, Admiral Soemu Toyota, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, told the men of his newly established Special Suicidal Sea Attack Force that The fate of our empire depends upon this one action, despite strong opposition from his naval general staff regarding the naval use of suicidal special forces. I give the Special Sea Attack Force the order to do the war's most valiant and sad deed on Okinawa. The Surface Special Attack Unit is ordered to proceed via Bungo Suido Channel at dawn on Y1 day to reach the prescribed holding position for a high-speed run-in to the area west of Okinawa at dawn on Y day. Admiral Toyoda's most tragic and heroic act of the war was to order all of the SSAF sailors to go on a mission to fight to the last man. The order was given to the SSAF staff on April 5, 1945. Attacking and destroying the opposing supply train and fleet is your task. Y Day falls on April 8th. The special order sending the Yamato to Okinawa was written in large letters on white paper and posted on the port side of the first deck, stated Shizuo Kunimoto, a lieutenant junior grade on the Yamato. All 2,000 soldiers who were not on duty were gathered on the forecastle after the Yamato set sail, so that the ship's executive officer could read their individual orders. After learning of their collective death warrant, the Yamato sailors courageously carried on with their traditions. Kunimoto ordered his warriors to bow first toward their residences and then toward the Imperial Palace. For almost 10 minutes, he then led them in, singing patriotic military songs, but bravery and patriotism didn't alter what the majority of Yamato's sailors knew would happen to them. Based on the chrysanthemum crest of 14th century samurai hero Kusunoki Masashige, Operation Kikusui, or Floating Chrysanthemums, saw waves of Japanese aircraft launch suicide strikes against ships of the Allied Pacific Fleet on April 6, 1945, Y2 day for the SSAF. In what became known as the pinnacle of samurai loyalty, Kusunoki obediently and consciously led his army and himself to death while battling to carry out his emperor's deadly and stupid instruction. One of the tenets of kamikaze was unwavering devotion to their emperor, who was seen as a god both before and during World War II. The SSAF's sailors, who are purportedly all volunteers, were told to die in the same valiant way as Kusunoki Masashige, as were the first Japanese pilots. Ten Ichigo, or Heaven Number 1, was the IJN's mission designation, and the SSAF was given the painfully straightforward directive to sail straight into the American ships and transports assisting the Okinawa landing and punish them as severely as could. The Yamato would then be beached and help Okinawa's land defensive forces with its 18.1-inch main guns and additional armaments. Members of this surplus Yamato crew, that is, all non-gunners, would subsequently depart off the beached Yamato and battle alongside Okinawan defense garrison men until they died on land. The escort ship's crews would also lose their lives in combat. No one was to come back alive at all. However, harbor officials risked execution by refueling the entire SSAF to capacity, giving them more than enough oil to return home if they somehow survived, despite the Japanese Naval General Staff's directive that each ship be given only enough fuel for a one-way trip to Okinawa. The suicide mission's men. The Yamato was carrying 2 of the 3 admirals in the SSAF. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito oversaw the whole SSAF, while Admiral Kosaku Ariga led the Yamato. Rear Admiral Keizu Kimura commanded the Yahagi and the 8 escort destroyers that made up the 2nd Destroyer Squadron, with the Yahagi serving as the command center. Although Seiichi Ito had fiercely opposed the mission, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who was based close to Tokyo, had final say. The primary reason for Seiichi Ito's objection was the total absence of air protection, which the kamikaze pilots did not have as they entered their death dives on April 6th. Ito also opposed the mission because he was worried about his force's tremendous numerical inferiority, 8 destroyers against America's 60. He also took issue with the sailing time. He requested that the schedule be set up so that the SSAF could come and launch an attack at night. When his claim that the mission commander should decide the departure time was denied, Ito allegedly clenched his teeth in frustration. On the night of April 5th, 1945, Y3 Day, the night before the SSAF left on its last mission, the Yamato's crew was depressed and unhappy, rather than thrilled about the possibility of being selected to die valiantly for the Emperor. 3 directives were announced on the ship's public address system at 5:30 p.m. Every cadet gets ready to depart the ship. Assign sank to every division. Open the store on the ship. 3 days after their arrival, 67 Itajima Naval Academy, class number 74 naval cadets were told to go ashore. However, the cadets were first called to the first wardroom, which is typically used by junior grade lieutenants and Yamato ensigns. Sake was ceremoniously consumed as a parting drink. Jiro Nomura, the executive officer of Yamato, forcefully but compassionately forced the cadets to depart, despite their entreaties to stay. Nomura remarked, "We couldn't bear to take them along on an expedition into certain death." Many sailors drank a lot of alcohol and sang depressing folk songs that evening. About 20 sailors were reassigned at the last minute, and about a dozen sailors who were very sick were transferred the following morning, April 6th. When they heard the news, their eyes glowed with relief and regret. There was also the issue of the elder sailors, those over 40 who had already shown themselves useless in the little combat the Yamato had witnessed. Their unjustified deaths would be a terrible blow to their families. Admiral Ariga conferred and allowed a few of these soldiers to depart the ship. A black omen, the Asashimo's sinking. That day, the SSAF sailed, with the ships departing Tokuyama at 4:00 p.m. The SSAF was commanded by the Yamagi, then the 8 destroyers, and finally the Yamato. The SSAF, as intended, departed with no air support at all on the same day that 355 kamikaze planes launched the greatest kamikaze strike of the war against the Allied Pacific Fleet. First-rate crews, veterans of numerous engagements, manned the 9 escort vessels. On her last journey, nevertheless, their small force had no chance whatsoever of successfully defending the Yamato. The submarine Threadfin SS-410, which was patrolling close to Fukushima, a small island at the opening of the Bungo Strait, notified the Americans. The Threadfin transmitted the SSAF's position to COM Sub-PAC, Commander, Submarine Forces Pacific, at Guam at 9 p.m. on Y2. Submarine Hackleback, SS-295, later saw the Yamato and reported the location of the SSAF. The Yamatobi name was often mentioned by the radio operators as the American submarines openly spoke with one another in unencrypted English. As stated by the U.S., the 2 submarines were instructed to monitor and report the movements of the Japanese ships, but not to attack without authorization, according to Navy data that Japanese scholars were able to collect after the war. The fact that Radio Officer Ensign Shigeo Yamada on the Yamagi was a Nisei, the son of Japanese immigrants to the U.S., was unknown to the Americans. Yamada, who was born and raised in America, interpreted what he heard the Americans say and relayed it to his superior officers. Born in Idaho and claiming to have been raised on potatoes, Yamada recalled that American radio operators frequently called the Yamato as King Battleship. Like fellow Nisei Kunio Nakatani, he and his family had been sent to a Japanese university and were stranded when the war began. These and other Nisei students might be drafted, imprisoned for their cooperation, or even put to death for espionage. For these young Americans, joining the IJN frequently felt like the greatest option. After his American citizenship was lost after the war, Shigeo Yamada was permitted to return to the United States, where he worked for Japan Airlines, JAL, until returning to Japan as a vice president of JAL. Yamada would survive the sinking of the cruiser Yamagi. On April 7th, Y1 day, just before 7 a.m., the Asashimo raised the signal engine casualty and started to lag behind the SSAF fleet. As the Asashimo fell further and further behind the rest of the SSAF, several sailors on the Yahagi interpreted this as a bad sign for the entire unit. In his 2007 memoir, The Imperial Navy's Final Sortie, Takekuni Ikeda, an ensign aboard the Yamagi, recalled, "But the Asashimo continued to fall behind and gradually disappeared in the mist. I still vividly recall how silent the Yahagi bridge was. It was under these circumstances that the day of destiny began." The Yamato's radar picked up an increasing number of American aircraft loitering over them as the morning wore on. The Asashimo radioed that she was interacting with enemy planes at 10 minutes past noon, but then her radio suddenly stopped working. The Asashimo had been sunk. 326 men from her crew perished in the sinking. Attack on Battleship Yamato's first strike. Although a significant number of people were killed in the Americans' opening raids, their primary assaults had not yet occurred. Skilled Japanese lookouts on the other SSAF ships noticed the growing number of U.S. Above them circle Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver bombers, Chance Vought F-4U Corsair fighters, and Navy Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters. At first, Admiral Raymond Spruance, the commander of the Fifth Fleet, ordered 6 of his battleships that were bombarding the beaches of Okinawa from land to get ready to assault the battleship Yamato. However, Spruance was pressured to alter his orders and substitute airstrikes from Task Force 58 planes for the 6 battleships by Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitscher, leader of the formidable carrier Task Force 58. Despite Spruance's warning to stay away from the battleship, Mitscher was adamant about attacking the Yamato. Mitscher had ordered up flights of 280 and 106 planes, respectively, at around 10 News a.m. on Y1 day. He had asked Spruance for authorization to strike Yamato and her escorts only after his planes had taken off. "You take them," was Spruance's succinct response. On Y1 day, the SSAF crews had been in the general quarters since the break of day. As the ships prepared for battle, all doors, hatches, and ventilators were securely secured, following a ceremonial breakfast at 7 a.m. Around 8:45, 7 Grumman F-6F Hellcat scout planes were seen flying above the SSAF. While circling the force, the Hellcats did not attempt to assault and maintain their distance. The Yamato fired a volley from her 18.1-inch cannons at 2 Martin Mariner PBM seaplanes that the Japanese had discovered at 10:14, but it was unsuccessful. The submarine Hackleback was also seen by the Japanese to be following them. A scout plane informed the Yamato 3 minutes later that Task Force 58 had been 250 nautical miles, 288 statute miles east of Okinawa from the SSAF. The first full strike of Mitscher's aircraft, consisting of 280 fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, prepared to assault the SSAF within Task Force 58 at approximately 10 a.m. on Y1 day. The American pilots were tense because they knew the Yamato was their only real target. On board the Yamato, a messenger boy joyfully announced to everyone that the crew would be having bean soup and dumplings for supper. His countenance was beaming, and he showed no signs of understanding the older men's distress. The carrier Yorktown, CV-10, took off more than 30 minutes after the other groups, launching 43 aircraft at 10:38. The Yamato's lookouts saw American aircraft about 4,000 yards, 23 miles, off the battleship's port bow at around 12:34. After the Yamato started firing, the SSAF accelerated to almost 28 knots, 32 mph at 12:41, which was the same speed as the Yamato. When the 9 18.1-inch guns detonated, they released Sanshikadan beehive rounds, which were projectiles that worked similarly to shotgun shells and released thousands of pellets or shrapnel fragments into the air. The American planes passed right through the shrapnel produced by these shells, despite the fact that they were specifically meant to be fired from ships against attacking aircraft. 6 6.1-inch guns, 24 5-inch anti-aircraft guns, 150 25mm 0.98-inch anti-aircraft guns, and 4 13mm 0.51-inch machine guns joined the Yamato's main guns in firing, but the gunners soon discovered that their curtain of anti-aircraft fire was much less effective than they had anticipated. This firing did not result in any significant American casualties. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners were unable to sustain coordinated fire against the zigzagging American planes due to casualties and communications damage. Fear played a significant role. "As I made the run, I could see bursts of anti-aircraft fire all around the plane," said Harvey Ewing, a rear seat gunner in an attacking Avenger. "It would be an understatement to say that I felt afraid. As the ship fired all of her guns, including its 18-inch rifles, at the planes that were following us in, we dropped the fish, torpedoes, and appeared to dangle there for minutes. The battleship Yamato was struck by 2 bombs at around 12:40, both of which landed close to the aft secondary gun turret. 3 minutes later, a torpedo struck her port bow. In addition to causing major damage, the bombs killed people and disabled the fire control unit of the aft secondary battery. In addition to killing men, the detonating torpedo let 2,350 tons of water spill onto the Yamato. By counterflooding with roughly 604 tons of water, the damage control unit was able to contain the damage. A listing ship's opposing section is flooded in an attempt to maintain the ship level and balanced. The destroyer Hamikaze was sunk at around 12:47. A torpedo blast split her in 2 after a bomb struck her aft deck, shooting a column of flames skyward. She had 240 men on board, and 100 of them were killed and 45 injured. Around the same moment, a 500-pound bomb was hit to starboard on top of the Suzuki's No. 2 gun mount, causing it to catch fire. Despite being struck once more, she struggled back to Japan. Of her crew of 263 men, 34 were injured and 57 were killed. The SSAF collapses. The first wave of American jets finished their attack and retreated at around 12:50, while the second wave arrived at around 1:02 p.m. The second wave attack was a concerted assault, with torpedo bombers arriving from all sides and flying just above the wave tops, while dive bombers launched their strikes high overhead. The Yamato was struck by at least 2 additional bombs and at least 4 torpedoes during this roughly half-hour-long second attack. In addition, the ship listed around 7 degrees to port and absorbed roughly 3,000 tons of water. By counter-flooding the boiler and starboard engine rooms, damage control fixed this perilous list. Although the roster was momentarily updated, many of the ship's men perished in the flooding. Since they were all members of a suicide force, many SSAF sailors were in the water at this time and were afraid that their fellow sailors would not try to save them. Admiral Toyota agreed with Admiral Seiichi Ito's decision to cancel the mission and direct the survivors' rescue after Ito realized his suicide attack force would never make it to Okinawa. As what they knew to be certain death drew near, men reacted differently. With a smile on his face, an officer enthusiastically commended the Americans for their courage and expertise. As water surged in around them, Damage Control Officer Kunamoto understood his ship was doomed. Nevertheless, he started cheering, "Long reign the Emperor," with his fellow sailors. The possibility of their death or the sinking of their powerful Yamato was not acceptable to all of the sailors. We were told by our senior chief that we were not able to return alive from the mission. I was busy operating my anti-aircraft gun all through the battle until the ship's last minutes, recalled Heiji Tsuboi, a former petty officer second class who had manned the battleship's No. 5 anti-aircraft battery. I vividly recall that I experienced a very intense jolt that came from the ship's bottom. I didn't think the ship would be sunk, but I assumed it was a torpedo assault. The Yamato's size gave her an easy target, and she was mercilessly bombarded from below by torpedoes, and from above by a ceaseless barrage of bombs and gunfire. On the task force's doomed ships, scenes of bravery and sorrow were shown. 20-year-old Ensign Yoshida Mitsuru, who was on the Yamato's bridge, watched in horror and shock as American dive bombers launched 3 more torpedoes into the ship's port side, and then rained deadly machine gun fire on the anti-aircraft gun operators as the end drew near. That these pilots repeated their attacks with accuracy and coolness was a stunning demonstration of the unimaginable, undreamed-of strength of our adversaries, he wrote later. Requiem for Battleship Yamato contains Mitsuru's narrative of surviving the ship's demise. One of the most moving stories he tells is about Kunio Nakatani, a Nisei ensign and assistant communications officer who was drafted out of school at Keio University. His 2 younger brothers were in the United States, Army, and working in Europe. According to Mitsuru, Nakatani was a kind young man who worked hard at his job, The younger officers treated Nakatani with disdain and continuously denigrated him, despite the fact that he was the only person on the Yamato capable of receiving and translating American signals. Just before the Yamato set sail on her last journey, Nakatani showed Yoshida a letter he had received from his mother in America, which had been sent through Switzerland. "We are fine. Please give your duties your best effort. Let's both offer our prayers for peace." Dark waves splattered and reached for us as the stricken ship heeled to an incredible list of 80 degrees, Yoshida wrote, recalling the final moments of the capsizing battleship, attributing to the ocean an almost evil presence. When the American aircraft launched a major attack against the light cruiser Yahagi due to a sudden break in the low clouds, sailors on board continued to perish as the SSAF broke up. The Yahagi was hit at the stern at 1330, and the ship started to make a continuous turn to starboard. Then, she stopped completely and began to drift in a swell, recalled Takakuni Ikeda. American aircraft fired weapons at the still Yahagi repeatedly. My entire body began to tremble violently. My eardrums were damaged, so it felt like I was watching a silent film. One by one, water columns taller than the mast leaped up around the ship. Steam rose from the funnel of the warship. The fragrance of gunpowder blended with the crimson smell of our injured and dead seamen. Yahagi's fate was sealed. When the destroyer squadron's commander, Rear Admiral Keizo Kimura, saw that his flagship was sinking, he made the decision to move his flag to a destroyer. Because of the constant American strikes, he signaled the Isokazi to approach, but not much could be done. American bombs severely damaged the Isokazi during her attempt to reach the Yahagi, and gunfire subsequently destroyed it. She lost 20 of her 239 crew members and injured 54 more. American bombs also caused significant damage to the destroyer Kasumi, which contributed to its destruction. Out of her 200 crew, 17 were killed and 47 were injured. Taking the ship down. There was no pause in the aerial attack. The last and most destructive attack, the 3rd American strike force of 43 aircraft of Air Group 9, landed at approximately 1:45 under the command of Lieutenant CMDR Herbert Hauck, the Yorktown assault leader. Despite differing reports, it seems that 3 or more bombs destroyed the Yamato's remaining superstructure and severely wounded the crews of her 25mm anti-aircraft guns. As hundreds of liters of water flowed into the Yamato, 3 torpedoes struck the port side, causing her to resume what turned out to be an unstoppable roll to port. As American planes resumed their relentless attacks, the battleship's now vulnerable starboard hull was exposed to attack due to her continuous roll to port. The list was lowered by 10 degrees by counter-flooding, but more list reduction necessitated flooding the fire and starboard engine rooms. Desperate counter-flooding techniques were used to preserve the ship, but the ever-increasing torrent of water streaming in through the torn hull trapped several crewmen below decks and drowned them. 3 bombs detonated amidships at 2:02, which coincided with the much later order to abandon ship being issued when more torpedoes struck the Yamato. Swimming crewmen were drawn back toward the ship and into her propellers by the suction caused by the roll to port and sinking of the ship. The diameter of each 3-bladed propeller was close to 20 feet. Many of the pilots saw it as retaliation for Pearl Harbor, and the Yorktown planes showed no mercy to the Japanese ships and sailors. The Yahagi, which had been struck by 7 torpedoes and 12 bombs, sank at 2:05 precisely 1 minute after the final bomb struck her. There were 446 men killed and 133 injured out of a crew of 736. Desperate, Ariga ordered the starboard engineering spaces to be counter-flooded once more on the Yamato, but it didn't help. To make matters worse, hundreds of men who were working on the battleship's lower decks were sentenced to drowning without even being given a chance to live. Tsuboi remained at his post until the order to leave the ship was delivered. He would swim clear, just like Yoshida and Kunamoto. Vice Admiral Ito passed away. He shook hands with the few staff officers he had left and headed for his flag cabin to wait for the end, when he realized he would not complete his mission and that the majority of the troops in his squadron were either dead or wounded. He was followed by Lieutenant CMDR Ishida, his adjutant. Ishida had been assigned to wait on the admiral. He now wanted to die with him, but the chief of staff resisted him. "You are not required to leave." Ishida paused, turned away, and then gave in. "Don't be a fool." He disregarded his admiral. Ariga did not survive, but Ishida did. Ariga, remaining in the anti-aircraft command post on the very top of the bridge, wearing his flak jacket and helmet, tied himself to the binnacle, the non-magnetic housing for the ship's compass, after finishing the last dispositions, which included the Emperor's portrait, the code books, and other items. He intended to sink with his ship, thus he took this action to prevent his body from being washed away when the Yamato sank. Then he yelled the battle cry and Japanese cheer, Banzai, and ordered all crew to come on deck, 3 times before turning to face the 4 lookouts who were still with him. They didn't want to leave their captain because they were loyal to him, but Ariga wouldn't have it that way. He pushed them into the water, gave them a shoulder clap, and urged them to be happy. As though to express his innermost thoughts, the 4th sailor pressed his final 4 cookies into the captain's hand. The captain smiled as he accepted them. When he and the Yamato vanished in a massive explosion, he was last seen consuming the 2nd cookie. In May 1945, Captain Ariga received a posthumous promotion of 2 grades to Vice Admiral. When the Yamato sank, Kunio Nakatani did not make it out alive. Regarding his shipmate and comrade who was born in the United States, Yoshida Mitsuru stated, "Radio Officer Ensign Nakatani must have also perished at his post while intercepting enemy communications. His actions constantly garnered notice since he was a Nisei, and I assume his death was just as magnificent as those of his compatriots." Death strike for Yamato. At 2:05, the Yamato's list, which had grown to 15 degrees to port, was so great that torpedoes fired into the starboard side of the battleship and set to a depth of 20 feet, smashed beneath the armor, and burst straight into the battleship's exposed hull. A ledge was created along the outside hull by the Yamato's 16.5-inch thick armor plate, which tapered to 3.9 inches at 20 feet below the waterline. "I saw the runs and figured they got at least 5 hits, Huck wrote in his report. The torpedoes detonated directly in the ship's belly due to the 20-degree listing. According to Hauk's testimony, during this 3rd raid, the Yamato was struck by at least 8 torpedoes. It was the huge ship's final blow. Slowly, she rolled over her port side and capsized. The majority of Yamato's sailors were either killed or thrown into the sea by a massive explosion that occurred at 2:23. It made a mighty big bang, Hauk recounted after taking pictures with a wing camera. Smoke rose. The height of the fireball was roughly 1,000 feet. Huck was correct. The explosion was a mighty big bang, and sentries in Kagoshima, more than 124 miles distant, could see the mushroom cloud that resulted, which was more than 4 miles high. Although the exact origin of the explosion is unknown, it is thought that one of the Yamato's 2-bow magazines detonated, causing the doomed battleship's foresection to break in a massive blow. The Yamato swiftly sank. Out of the approximately 332 men on her crew, 2,740 perished and 117 were injured. The Yahagi and 4 of her 8 escort destroyers had also submerged beneath the seas, in addition to the mighty battleship itself. A total of 72 soldiers were killed and 34 wounded on the 4 destroyers that survived. The Fuyutsuki, Hatsushimo, Suzutsuki, and Yukikaze. Approximately 981 officers and soldiers from the escort ships lost their lives, and 342 others were injured in the tragic suicide strike, which, even by samurai standards, had no chance of carrying off its kamikaze aim. 10 aircraft and 14 aircrew members were lost by the Americans, while 3 others were hurt. An undetermined number of bombs and torpedoes destroyed the biggest and most potent warship in the world in less than 2 hours. The Yamato Legacy. April 7, 1945, is not the conclusion of the SSAF and Yamato narrative. The ship's wreckage has been successfully located over the years, with the first reports of success coming in 1985. Shigeru Makino, one of the Yamato's designers, attested to the photographic recordings taken during this fruitful initial search, confirming that they contain distinguishable remnants of the Yamato. According to the researchers, the wreck is located in more than 1,100 feet of water off the southern island of Kyushu, 180 miles southwest of Kagoshima. The battleship is divided into two main sections, a 264-foot stern segment and a roughly 560-foot bow to midships section. The Yamato continues to have a significant impact on Japanese culture in a nation that is trying to make up for its violent history. Museums and memorials to the giant, her crew, and the other dead sailors of the ill-fated SSAF have been constructed, and books and movies have been made about the ship and the SSAF. The Yamato wreck was utilized to build a spacecraft with the same name in a science fiction television series. A few of the characters on the starship Yamato have names with their real-life counterparts. The SSAF narrative has a gloomy undertone, despite the fact that an excellent Yamato museum featuring a large-size model of the ship opened in Kure in 2005. When the SSAF survivors returned to Japan, they were treated as virtual prisoners by the IJN. Kazuhiro Fukumoto, a Yamato survivor, stated in an interview that, "We were held in Kure for a month. For a month and a half, parents who were aware of the Yamato sinking did not see their sons. Believing their sons were dead, they gave up." Many of the survivors and their close relatives were psychologically troubled by the SSAF's devastation. More than 280 surviving SSAF veterans and their immediate family members embarked on a memorial cruise on April 3, 2006, sailing the same path as the SSAF to the precise spots where friends and family members lost their lives on Y1 Day, April 7, 1945. Similar memorial trips had taken place in 1987, 1994, and 1995. But in 2006, the families and survivors decided that the memorial voyage to honor those who lost their lives while serving with the Special Suicide Attack Surface Force would be the last one because the youngest survivor was over 80 years old.